We finished yesterday.
US 80.
Huh?
US 80.
Okay, so let's get back to the Mujahideen. We have the Iranian hostage crisis, Iranian Revolution, Star Wars. Riding a bike, or I'm sorry, riding the back of a truck. Can we do this? Yeah, I think we can do that. There's a bunch of them. These are all human little pyramid things. And the U.S. the U.S. boycotted this one. The Soviets boycotted in 1984, Los Angeles. So we're right here, fundamentalist Sunnis. We get right here. And this is going to become an issue. Because what we're going to say is the godless commies are going to take away your religion. And so we actively encourage Sunni Muslims from all over the world to come fight in Afghanistan, especially from the Middle East. And countries are having trouble with their fundamentalist Sunnis, like in Saudi Arabia, would say, oh, you don't like our government is not strong enough for you? Go to Afghanistan. And the CIA would help set up a base for these foreign nationals to come into Afghanistan and fight. And they'd be armed. CIA would give money to Pakistani intelligence, who would give money to groups like, here's the base, called Al-Qaeda. I wonder if this will have any implications down the road. I wonder if something's going to happen a few years later called blowback. Those of you who read in history, ahead in history knows, yes, it's going to be huge. And one of the big things, this is a man-portable anti-aircraft missile called a Stinger. And Soviet helicopters were the terror of the Mujahideen. And these started to make it more difficult for the helicopters, shot a few down, they're incredibly expensive, and would make the war much more difficult for the Soviets. This will kind of become their Vietnam. But you're going to see it over its period of years. And oops. Let me make one quick change. Oh, give me a second. Sorry about that. One more thing. While this is going on, starting back in 1972, Congress would pass, get the 2/3 vote necessary for the Equal Rights Amendment, the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, the Equal Rights Amendment is very basic. It dealt with the issue that the 14th Amendment never quite made it clear about men and women having equal rights. So it says no discrimination based on sex. It is really that simple of an amendment. But it needs 3/4 of the states. And it immediately got over 30. It looked like it was going to get all 38. It looked like it was going to happen right away. I should add, Montana voted for it right away. Montana in 1971 had passed a constitution with those words in it. That is in the current state constitution. And Montana, a vastly different state than it is today, but they ratified it right away. But it was about 3 short. And that's where it would stay all the way through the rest of the decade. And it had to be ratified by 81. That was the time limit. And this became a major issue in the election. Or this going to become a major issue in the election of 1980. Well, almost immediately, there was a backlash against this. That people who are more conservative believe that this was going to destroy the traditional family. Remember the cult of domesticity. And one of the leaders would be an incredibly intelligent person by the name of Phyllis Schlafly, who said that this would destroy the traditional role of women, which was to be subservient to men, obey men, and this will blow up families. Women will get divorced. They will abandon their children. Here she is right here. Stop ERA. And Phyllis Schlafly was a very talented person, which is kind of interesting, kind of disproving this whole traditional role of women was to be subservient to men, because she was clearly out ahead of this and showing she could do this. But this would be fatal for the ERA, because a lot of men who were worried about losing their own status said, hey, if women can't even decide whether or not they want equal rights, why should we want? And they would use derogatory terms like this is only a catfight and we shouldn't fight, shouldn't worry about it. But one of the biggies that really hit the ERA was the bathroom issue. The idea that if you have no discrimination based upon sex, public restrooms will go from being men and women to just a public restroom. And therefore, society would break down. And this shows it really clear. They're not subtle in this pamphlet that was handed out. This is progress. Vote no on the ERA, walking in there, and they don't hide what they're implying. Bathroom issues have gone to this very day about this. So it's interesting how it always comes back to this bathroom issue. Can you imagine a public place not having a men and women's bathroom? It's unimaginable. So thankfully that was stopped. I can't help it, I'm facetious there, obviously, right? There are many places with a unisex bathroom. And so, was this going to be an issue? Well, they certainly made it out to be. But the other one is, this was also a very common thing on lesbians, if they got equal rights. And that was said over and over again, and there was a lot, thing with the prejudice of the time, it worked. The ERA did not pass. And this would become a major issue of the Republican campaign. When it was first ratified, it was signed by President Nixon, a Republican, supported by President Ford, a Republican. But by the end of the decade, the Republican Party was 100% opposed to the ERA. 100% opposed. And it would not pass. I should add, it would not pass today. Not even close. Montana would vote against it. It would not pass Montana's legislature. And it would not pass Congress, and the president would not sign it today, so it wouldn't even. There's no way it would pass. So women are not guaranteed equal rights, and that would not change. Today, things could change. I mean, things are changing all the time. So, the election of 1980, you have the Democrats under Carter, but the Democrats were split. Carter was very unpopular amongst the Democrats, let alone Republicans. And John Kennedy's brother, Ted Kennedy, actually ran in the primary and nearly took it away from Carter. So the Republicans, after years of turmoil between liberal and conservative Republicans known as the New Right took over. And Ronald Reagan, former actor, and he spoke out against things like Medicare or Medicaid, the Great Society, became governor of California, and then the presidential nominee. And he rode this conservative backlash. ERA was just part of it. But the biggest issue was anger over oil and stagflation. And when the Federal Reserve raised interest rates because of the inflation, a short but nasty recession took place in 1980. Who's always blamed for these kind of issues? The president. Usually, it's much more complex than blaming the president for high oil prices or anything else. One more thing, people in 1980 were much more dependent upon petroleum products than today. The economy is more diversified, even though, as anyone who's paid attention to what's happening to prices right now, when oil prices go up, it dramatically affects us today. But it was even more then. And it felt like we're losing the Cold War. Losing the Cold War. And for the first time, really in history, there's an argument about the Second Great Awakening way back in 1840, but there was a divide over religion, especially evangelical Christians, who became more and more known as the religious right, who voted about 50-50 in parties. In fact, probably more for Jimmy Carter, who was openly evangelical. But they switched to over 90% evangelical Christians voting for Republicans, and it's been that way ever since. And their big pushing was family values. And anti-ERA was one we just mentioned, abortion rights was one, which is also really fascinating. Evangelical Christians were actually, by polls, supportive of abortion rights in 1974, totally opposed to it by 1980. It's interesting how attitudes change on that, but also civil rights. This big backlash. And then lastly, anti-government. Watergate in Vietnam, that people have a bad taste about government. One more thing. These new conservatives were desperate to get rid of the New Deal and the Great Society, but they didn't want to say it publicly. People loved Social Security. They didn't want to say they wanted to get rid of it. People loved Medicare, health insurance for the elderly, because it was far too expensive in private insurance to not have it. But they didn't want to admit it. But they were going to try to gut the New Deal. And so it very much fits this idea, let's go back to this better era. Not the way it really was, but the way we like to believe. They really said the 50s a lot. There's a big nostalgia of the 50s. Thus, President Reagan's slogan, let's make America great again. And when the election happened, a month before the election, it really looked like it was going to be a close, but probably Carter victory. Carter was ahead in the polls by about 8%. 8% ahead in the polls. When the election finally happened, Carter lost by 10%. In the last month before the election, the whole thing did a 180. It wasn't so much a pro-Reagan vote as an anti-Carter vote. And probably the biggest thing were that just the persistently high prices. Persistently high prices. And this is going to happen a number of times. We'll see it again and again. We're seeing it right now. If you look at President Trump's approval rating, it's about as low as any president has ever been. Why? Prices. Probably the biggest reason. There are other things going on, obviously, but most people vote with their pockets. So, ironically, the hostage crisis was still going on. And even though Carter negotiated a release finally, as a last slap in the face to Carter, the hostages were not released until the day, in fact, the hour after Reagan was inaugurated. A last slap in the face to Carter, another humiliation. Carter would go on to live to 100 years old and devote his life to helping others. He is a very interesting man, but his presidency was not seen as a success. Reagan came in actually kind of scary. Almost immediately they're talking about sending US troops to Nicaragua to put down their socialist government. And he wanted massive tax cuts for the very wealthy, huge defense spending. And it looked like it was going nowhere. Then an assassination attempt. John Hinckley, this is just seconds before, walked up to Reagan and opened up his revolver, killing a DC police officer and seriously wounding his Reagan's press secretary, hit in the head. Reagan was hit right here, and you can see him. He had just been hit, and they're putting him in the limousine and rushing him to the hospital. And John Hinckley was the assassin. And Hinckley had made the decision that the actress Jodie Foster would fall in love with him if he killed President Reagan. That's a very logical thought. And they're married to no. Yeah, he had spent a long time in various mental institutions. He's kind of a quasi half parole release now. But anyways, President Reagan was nearly killed. They kept it secret from the population how bad it was. They nearly lost him on the operating table. They implied lots of, just a minor wound. It was bad. But I can vividly remember this. So to let you know my age, I was in 8th grade. In the study hall. I can still vividly remember the study hall teacher, Mrs. Fretland. Everybody was terrified of Mrs. Fretland. And she was in front of the study hall. We're on these big tables, big kind of open like cafeteria-like room. And somebody ran in and told her something. And so this is 1981. And she stood up and said, class, and then kind of collapsed on her desk. Said, the president has been shot. And then started to cry and ran out. And never forget that. It's just so shocking. And whether you liked or disliked the president, everyone knows the president. And that's an attack on the United States. And the assumption was he died. Wouldn't you have thought the same thing? He's dead. And so I will never forget that. And we wouldn't find out for about 15 minutes later when the principal came on the announcements and told everybody the president has been taken to the hospital and he's going to be fine. And I can still vividly remember that. And yes, it is in my Lego book of assassinations. Cheft. Show you the picture. Yeah, see? Yeah, Lego book of assassination. Lego characters assassinating. See, there's John Hinckley with a gun. Pretty amazing, huh? Interesting, huh? Are you excited to see this? This one I'm not giving. You can never get out of my presidential assassination book with Legos. All right, so ironically, Democrats who control the House, Republicans have a slight majority in the Senate, we're not going to pass his tax cuts. After he was assassinated, it was almost like, well, we got to support him now. And enough conservative Democrats joined Republicans and his big tax cut proposal became passed. Big passed. First of two massive tax cuts, and what became known as Reaganomics. But Reagan said his massive tax cuts will balance the budget. They'll balance the budget. Meaning, even though we're cutting taxes, revenues will go up so much we'll get rid of the deficit. There was a belief that the budget deficit was really high. It actually wasn't that big. This is the percentage of the GDP of the debt. World War II, a lot of debt. Makes sense, right? It had been going down all the way to 1980. And so we got to cut back the debt. We're going to balance the budget, which is not necessarily a good thing. So Reaganomics, he promised would do that. And what was it? This is supply side. Supply side was another term for trickle down, but they didn't want to say trickle down because trickle down had bad connotations. And let's be very clear about this. What they said was the reason we had the bad economy of the 1970s was because the entrepreneurial spirit of the United States was being curtailed. And if the rich could get more money and more wealth, that would encourage them to innovate and create more production. And therefore, economic boom, and the money will trickle down to everybody. Instead of this demand side trying to get wages down, let's get wages low to save businessmen money. So, first off, deregulation. And the most important of the deregulation was to get rid of monopolies. They did a 180 and said monopolies are actually good because they're more efficient. And the US, from this moment on, has basically been very little to do about monopolies. Remember, monopolies antitrust, but also got environmental laws, worker safety laws, food safety laws, with the idea being that this is an expense, and you cut the expenses, but you get rid of regulations, more profit, more economic boom. Also, huge cut on social programs. This is very social Darwinistic, but social programs raise wages, and people are more secure, raise wages. So do everything from cut back on VA benefits to Vietnam War veterans, to they pretty much got rid of all mental hospitals. Also put them on the streets, the number of homeless went up. Cut school lunches by 2/3. Things like that. My favorite part about the school lunch, just a good little story about the administration. They wanted to cut back school budget, but school lunch, the law said you must provide fruits and vegetables as part of government aid for school lunches. All the cafeteria is mostly paid for by the government. Subsidized, and you pay a little bit for food. So how do you get around fruits and vegetables, which is kind of expensive? The Reagan administration announced that ketchup was a vegetable. And since ketchup is a vegetable, we don't need to provide actual vegetables. Because ketchup has all your major parts of a vegetable, right? Vinegar, salt, corn syrup. Corn, right? Vinegar, what's vinegar? Grapes. That's actually very true. And the cuts were, college was almost nothing. They drastically cut back on education, money for education. College would go up so much over the next 20 years, pretty much. Radically anti-union, unions, not good and bad things about unions, but unions raise wages. But the big thing was tax cuts, massive tax cuts for the very wealthy, not for working people. Working people actually had, most people got a tax increase because they doubled the social security tax. But the very wealthy, huge tax cuts. Highest marginal tax rates went from 70 to 50 to 28. Not quite to the tax cuts we just had under President Trump, but really big for the very wealthy. And the whole goal was deficits will drop because of economic growth. Economic growth will be so big. Did deficits drop? No. President Reagan had the largest deficit in history. In fact, the public debt accumulated in Reagan's 8 years as president will be larger than the accumulated debt of the United States from 1776 to 1981. So the debt went up a lot and go down because revenues dropped. That's what that graph shows. So it didn't do what he promised, but this is going to happen again. There'll be another tax cut similar to this in 2001. Deficit went up. And President Trump said the same thing in deficits. Pretty the biggest ever. So what happened? Well, the result is pretty startling. The Great Compression, where the gap between the rich and the poor was shrinking, reversed. And it's soon going to be called the Great Divergence, when the top and the bottom begin to grow. This actually is the net wealth of the top 1%. And that's the end of the Great Depression. Here is the wealth of the top. This is the bottom 90, top 1%. It's also sometimes you might hear called the K-shaped economy, and that's where we're at right. So defense spending also went up dramatically too. This is the largest defense increase in history, even bigger than Kennedy's. Now, President Trump, if his budget passes next year, will be by far the largest defense increase in history, comparable to World War II. But anyways, remember the bomber gap and the missile gap, where they said the Soviets have this big advantage? What Reagan called that same thing was a window of vulnerability. Because Democrats and liberals had allowed the US military to degrade. Remember, we lost in Vietnam. That's the argument. And Soviets have increased defense spending. They are now ready to hit us. And they began talking about, we're going to have to face the inevitable and fight a nuclear war. You know, it's the face. And I remember all these things about the new Cold War. Nightmare for NATO was another one. These are, if you didn't know, these are what we call magazines. Have you heard of magazines? Actually, kind of sad for me. Magazines, I love magazines. That was such a big part of my life, and now they've kind of died. So it's just kind of weird for me. Yes, that's me being old. But all this talk about it. And the reason why, and they also gave evidence that US intelligence had said, the CIA had said there's been a massive Soviet buildup. This is an actual chart that Reagan showed. This was in Newsweek, showing the massive increase in defense spending. And the CIA said, now intelligence, I don't know anything about intelligence, but intelligence is wrong a lot. It's really hard. But they were not just wrong a lot. It was a 180. Soviet defense spending was actually dropping in the 70s because they so increased it after the Cuban Missile Crisis that their economy was in shambles. And in the 1980s, they were cutting back on everything. But what the Reagan administration said is they're increasing spending and war is inevitable, and we must be ready to fight. And so the CIA turned out to be, well, wrong, but they're wrong on a lot of things. And another thing Reagan proposed, it's called the Strategic Defense Initiative, but everybody soon dubbed it Star Wars. So Reagan, the third of the Star Wars movies, Return of the Jedi, just come out. And it was fresh on everybody's mind. So it was dubbed Star Wars. And this was going to be a missile defense system. And it was going to involve like lasers and particle beam nets to catch missiles. And of course, anti-ballistic missiles. They knew it was at least 30 years before they could even come close to hitting a missile, but it freaked the Soviets out, who thought the United States was going to try to make a shield so they could attack the Soviet Union and be invulnerable. They didn't know how far the United States was and thought maybe they could do it. And this actually was incredibly provocative. I should add, yeah, today there's technology to shoot down some missiles, but they're relatively easy to defeat if you have very advanced missiles. The United States can do it. China can most certainly defeat it. So anyways, back to this. I should add, Return of the Jedi's not great. Anyone seen that one? Anyone seen that with the little rats, the little Ewoks? Yeah. Awful, right? You agree, right? Yeah, thank you for agreeing with me. The first Star Wars, great. Second one, pretty darn good. You like rodents? They're cute? Yeah. Okay, who thinks Ewoks are cute? Who thinks they look like rats? Am I too old and cynical? Yeah. So, this is going to lead to what we now call the Able Archer War Scare. Able Archer was a NATO war games that the Soviets believed was going to be a mask for an all-out attack. And when Reagan started referring to, yes, another Star Wars reference, the evil empire, the Soviets were absolutely convinced NATO was going to attack, especially when Reagan went on his weekly radio show on Saturday and not realizing that he's being broadcast. I mentioned this in the review, but I'll tell everyone this who missed it. Not realizing that it was broadcast, Reagan said, I've signed the law outlawing the Soviet Union. The missiles are on the way. Now, I know, and I agree with all of you, that's hilarious. The Soviets didn't think it was that funny. And it was broadcast, and they didn't realize it. And they were, it depends on where you look. They were anywhere from an hour from doing a preemptive strike against the West to at least half a day away. We now know, though, that their missiles are on full alert, ready to launch. They're smaller missiles in West Germany, but also their ICBMs. And they have loaded up small tactical nuclear weapons on their bombers in East Germany, ready to go, ready to scramble. It was that close. I should add, when British intelligence figured this out and told the president was shocked. He did not believe that his rhetoric of saying World War III is inevitable would convince the Soviets that World War III was inevitable. Reagan also believed that nuclear war would not be that bad and could be winnable. And this shook him to the core. And then he watched a miniseries called The Day After in 1983. It came out right after the Able Archer scare, which I want to say, thankfully, I had no idea in 1983 this was going on, because it would have scared me to death. The Day After was a 3-day miniseries about the unthinkable, nuclear war. And it centered around Kansas City, Missouri. And look, it would not have the same effect today. And some of the green screen special effects would not really work today because we're used to something different. But the movie was terrifying. It terrified Reagan to watch it in the White House theater. I can still remember this scene. She's outside her farm and the missiles launch and she's like looking up, thinking the war might happen. Oh, it was scary. It was so scary. And it shook Reagan. Oh, nuclear war is bad. And I'm not really exaggerating. He walked around the White House telling people, I didn't realize it'd be so bad. I didn't realize it, which is kind of sad. But one more thing happened during this time. In 81, 82, there was a recession. Another recession caused by high interest rates that put inflation down. And unemployment went up to 11%. Reagan's popularity took a big hit. But then it was a very short recession. When the rates were down and oil prices also dropped, the economy began to rise. And unemployment went down pretty dramatically, even though to our point of view today, The 7% unemployment in 1984 would have been seen as a nightmare today. In 1984, it was like, oh, we're finally coming out of it. Reaganomics might be working. But I should add, part of what happened, though, was this the beginnings of massive factory shutdowns called globalization. First starting with putting factories like textile mills in Mexico. This is the beginning of the deindustrialization of America. And so the election of 1984, the economy seemed to be doing better. And Reagan, who was so optimistic and promising a better world, or it's a slogan then, Morning in America. And it seemed like the economy was getting better. It seemed better after the disruption of the high oil prices. The gas prices were a lot lower. It just seemed better. The Democrats nominated former Minnesota Senator and Carter's Vice President Walter Mondale, who immediately said, the budget deficit's too high, we got to raise taxes. People didn't want to hear that. They want to hear Morning in America. And even though the election looked like it was going to be close, in the end it wasn't close. But let me add one more thing. The Democrats in 1984 were the first major campaign to have a woman on the ballot. So she was a congresswoman from New York, Geraldine Ferraro, and she would be the vice presidential nominee for president. First time. There would not be a woman on the top of a major party ticket until 2016, and that would be Hillary Clinton. So Reagan would win a pretty overwhelming victory. But not in Congress, not quite yet. But back to Miles City. So I will tell you, this is it. Somebody in this classroom graduated from high school. In beautiful Miles City, Montana. My graduating class, I think, was 220. I'll say it's, about 11,000 people then. That was about 8,000. And you want to see a picture of me in a class? There I am. You can see I'm right about there. We had to dress up a lot. I participated in activities, so here's me on the cricket field, playing cricket. And little did you know, you had to wear a top hat. There's no photographic evidence of my childhood. There's nothing. I just all of a sudden appeared at 18, it seems. I did not play cricket. That's not actually. As much as he looks like me, with my mustache back then. Yep, I have no picture, but yes, I did graduate from high school in 1980. So you can figure out my age. I graduated, let's see, I would have been 38 when I graduated. My junior year was tough. It was a 20-year. Okay, so arms control. Reagan did a 180. And instead of the buildup, he began to negotiate. But the big reason arms control began to happen, but also triggering the end of the Cold War, a new young man took over, okay, relatively young for the Soviet Union in his early 50s, Mikhail Gorbachev. Hey, they've been having fossils in their 80s. And they were literally called fossils. These all basically ruled the Soviet Union from hospital beds. But, Andropov, yeah, the former head of KGB, yeah, literally from a hospital bed. He wanted to save the Soviets, kind of like Khrushchev and end the Cold War. He proposed massive arms control agreement to Reagan, and Reagan did diplomacy. Conservatives were furious with Reagan in his own party for doing a 180 from the combative first term. Now that has been mostly forgotten by conservatives, but this would eventually lead to real arms control, dubbed START. Strategic Arms Reduction Talks. START. And for the first time, they begin to cut back on nuclear weapons. And the United States, over the next 20 years, will go from having nearly 40,000 nuclear weapons to having about 4,000. And the Soviets will go from over 50,000 to the Russians having less than 2. Now, I should add that the US has pulled out of START under President Trump, and we are beginning to build up weapons. At least that's what he says we're going to do. I don't really know, because things change a lot. We have more than enough to destroy the world many times still, so that's where we're at now. But back to Afghanistan. So remember, the United States was aiding the Mujahideen and Al-Qaeda. Things were going bad for the Soviets. High casualties, it was incredibly expensive, and the country was broke and under a lot of disruption. And in '87, the Soviets pulled out. And so they were defeated. They won most of the battles, much like the US in Vietnam, and yet pulled out. But I should add, what did the US do? The US supported the Mujahideen, this group of various different, everything from different ethnic, religious, and tribal groups fighting them. Once the Soviets pulled out, the US literally did this. Wiped their hands off of it and said, good luck, and walked away. And this infuriated members of the Mujahideen, who said the United States was just using our blood to defeat the Soviets, and then as soon as the war was over, they didn't care. All they care about is I wonder if this will become an issue down the road. And Afghanistan will devolve into civil war. Basically, Afghanistan has been in the middle of the civil war since 1979. And eventually a pretty radical fundamentalist Sunni group called the Taliban would take over southern Afghanistan. The Al-Qaeda remained allied to them. They didn't really like each other, but it was kind of the Al-Qaeda couldn't really go back. But there's still civil war all the way through today. Back to this. While this is going on, the biggest crisis of Reagan's presidency took place, called Iran conflict. We can't go into all the details, so let me explain it very quickly. U.S. mostly worked at the American University in Lebanon and Beirut. U.S. citizens were held hostage in Lebanon. Iran had influence over them. So the U.S. illegally sold weapons to Iran to release some of the hostages. Some were released. One of those hostages who would not be released, he would be killed. If anybody follows the NBA, the head coach of the Golden State Warriors right now, a guy named Steve Kerr, considered one of the best coaches in the NBA. He was a very good basketball player, too. His dad was a professor at the American University. So while he was at the University of Arizona, his dad was held hostage in Beirut, one of the hostages here. So back to this. Then they took the money and illegally sold it to this guerrilla group the U.S. set up in Nicaragua called the Contras. Both of these violated many federal laws, and it was run in the basement of the White House. Eventually, 11 people will go to jail. There'll be 40 indictments, but for various reasons, they would not go to jail, including the guy who ran it, a colonel, U.S. Marine colonel from the basement of the White House named Oliver North. But Reagan got off. No charges at all, even though it was run in his White House. And part of the reason was Democrats were actually really scared to do anything. But Reagan in his deposition said, I do not know, or I can't recall 130 times, 132 times. And he might have been lying. I bet he probably was about some of them. But the big thing was he probably really couldn't. The assassination attempt, we now believe, almost certainly triggered dementia that would lead to Alzheimer's disease. And they hid that for the American public, how far down he had gone by the end of his presidency in the depths of dementia. And that's what eventually would kill him. And that is absolutely terrifying disease. But they kept that secret. And so, under the next president, all of them will be pardoned. All of them. So even though the 80s economy was a little bit better, the election of 1988, Reagan's vice president, George Herbert Walker Bush, would run against the Democratic governor of Massachusetts. And it looked like at first that Dukakis would win, the Democratic governor. But Dukakis kind of ran away from what really worked for him. And George Herbert Walker Bush, who was from an incredibly wealthy patrician Massachusetts family, they moved to Texas. But he was incredibly wealthy, kind of portrayed this kind of regular, kind of affable, kind of a doofus, but in a nice way. But he was a warrior. Bush was a warrior. He flew torpedo bombers in World War II. In fact, his plane was shot down near Peleliu Island, and he rescued one of his crews. Because the Japanese would have caught him, they would have executed him. And so he was a war hero, moderate Republican, and he was elected president. So Bush was elected. And he therefore would be pardoned, Iran-Contra, but he would be the president when the Cold War ended. Gorbachev allowed for elections in Eastern Europe, and in East Germany, despite what the government said, the people in East Germany, once the elections happened every place else, they began to demand the takedown of the Berlin Wall, and they all just started walking towards the wall, and East German police were ordered to shoot them, didn't. And they climbed over the wall, and just like that, it was over. I still can vividly remember, here they came and knocked out part of the wall, that November 9th, that poster there. I'll never forget that, because the Cold War just seemed so much part of my life. You grew up with it every day, and all of a sudden it's just over. And now there's peace, and we'll never have to worry about war ever again. I just lied. I'm sorry, I just lied. No, there would not be a peace dividend. Now there's more war. But anyways, speaking of war, the Gulf War. There's going to be 2 Gulf Wars. In the 1980s, with US backing, Iraq attacked Iran, and what we call the Iran-Iraq War. It turned into a bloody draw with almost 1 million casualties, where the US even sold Iraq mustard gas to use against Iranians, and they used against their own civilians. But happened right there. Iraq, blaming low oil prices during the war on Kuwait, invaded Kuwait thinking they had American support. US was no friend of Kuwait, but this infuriated the United States, and there is the leader. The US helped put in the power. We had a very love-hate relationship with Saddam Hussein. I should have. Saddam Hussein despised Al-Qaeda. So that's going to lead to the second Gulf War, or as we call it, the Persian Gulf War. And so what the United States did is they convinced Saudi Arabia, Iraq's not done, they're coming for you. Here's Kuwait. And we convinced Saudi Arabia to allow US troops and our allies, eventually 38 countries would send troops, to Saudi Arabia. We lied to our team and said Iraq was about to attack. Saudi Arabia panicked. Saudi Arabia is a very small, not big population country. But anyways, the patience lasts a little bit. This was a big deal, because what is the most holy city in the Islamic world? And it's in Saudi Arabia. That's third. Mecca. There's never been a non-Muslim army in the Arabian Peninsula, occupying the Arabian Peninsula, occupying a nation that controls Mecca. Even in World War I, the British made sure they never sent troops to help the Arab rebellion because of Mecca. And now the US is in Saudi Arabia. Mostly non-Muslim army. Now, this became a big issue for a little group called Al-Qaeda. That would be the number one reason they attacked on September 11th. They thought this was part of an American plot to take Mecca. Was it? No, the US did not put troops in, but it didn't matter. So, tomorrow, one more thing. In 91, the US attacked. It's going to be called Operation Desert Storm. To liberate Kuwait, who is no friend of the United States. That's what always makes me laugh. All right, if you did not bring your books, bring them tomorrow, or I will publicly put your. What will we publicly do? Stocks? Wall sits, trench digging. Please bring your books. I will harass you, bug you, and the fines go up exponentially next week. You believe in that? Actually, you would not believe what a page goes to get a fine if you don't realize it. So please bring your books in, all three. Sound good? We're not leaving. It spells. But that was like a minute late. You notice that? Oh, very good.
Like the same thing with this whole like thing going on.
When you get older, the jowls start growing. I'm just letting you know. And you too. It's inevitable for everybody.